The revolving doors of Caldwell Automotive Group's headquarters moved like they owned the people walking through them. Glass, chrome, and the kind of engineered silence that costs money to maintain. Garrett Finch pushed through them with his daughter Sophie's hand tucked inside his, and the smell of motor oil that never fully washed out of his knuckles. His jacket was the good one, the only good one. Dark navy, bought 3 years ago for Karen's funeral, and worn exactly twice since. Sophie had noticed it hanging on the bathroom door that morning and asked if someone had died again. He'd told her no, they were just going somewhere important. She'd nodded and tied her own shoes, which she'd learned to do 2 months ago, and still did with enormous concentration, tongue pressed between her teeth. She was 7. Her sneakers had small maple leaves printed on the sides because she'd picked them herself at the store in Parry Sound, and one of the laces had a fraying end that Garrett kept meaning to replace. "Dad, it smells like new cars in here." Sophie whispered this like it was a secret. "It does, yeah. Is that good?" It used to be. The reception desk at Caldwell was a long sweep of white quartz that caught the morning light and threw it back at you. Behind it sat a young man with the particular smile of someone trained to make people feel welcome while simultaneously assessing whether they belonged. His name tag said Tristan. "Can I help you?" Tristan's eyes moved in that practiced way. Jacket, jeans, the little girl. Back to the jacket. "I need to see Owen Callard. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but this is about the Ridgeline acquisition. The vote's scheduled for 11. Something shifted in Tristan's posture. Almost nothing. A slight recalibration around the shoulders. "Mr. Callard is in a pre-board session. He's not available for walk-ins." Garrett shifted the folder in his hand. Legal-sized, thick, held together with a rubber band because he hadn't been able to find a proper clasp at the garage and hadn't wanted to stop at the office supply store with Sophie in tow. It looked wrong here. Everything about him looked wrong here. Tell him Garrett Finch is here. Tell him it's about the Ridgeline engineering reports. The real ones. I'm afraid I can't interrupt a board session for that. Then tell him I'll be standing in this lobby until someone listens to me or security removes me, whichever Caldwell prefers. Tristan picked up his phone. His voice went low and careful. Garrett caught the words unauthorized visitor and claims to have documents. Sophie pressed closer to his leg. She'd been to the dealership in town with him before, the small one where he sometimes sourced parts, and she was comfortable around cars and the people who worked on them. This was different, and she could feel it. "Daddy, right here, Bug. Are we in trouble?" "No. We're doing something important." She accepted this. Sophie had a quality Karen used to call her old soul patience, the ability to wait without fidgeting, to read a room without being told what she was reading. She'd had it since she was 4. It sometimes made Garrett's chest hurt to look at her. The security guard who arrived was polite. That was the word for it. Polite in the way that had roughness underneath it, the way good manners sometimes do when the person wearing them has been trained to use them precisely, so things don't escalate. "His name tag," said Walt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. I'm not leaving until someone in that boardroom has seen what's in this folder." Walt glanced at Tristan. Tristan gave a small nod. "I understand you have concerns." Walt's voice was steady. "But you can't be here without an appointment, and disrupting board proceedings is something we take seriously." "I'm not disrupting anything. I'm preventing a mistake, sir." "The Ridgeline fleet has a torque management defect in the transfer case." Garrett's voice stayed level, but something underneath it went hard. "It presents in cold weather, below -15. The differential locks up under hard acceleration. 3 vehicles have already had incidents in the field. Caldwell's internal engineering team flagged it 8 months ago, and someone buried the report before it reached the board." He paused. "They're voting today to approve full production and fleet deployment across 6 provinces. 38,000 vehicles." Walt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Sophie. "Is there someone who can come get her?" he asked quietly. "She stays with me. Sir, if we have to remove you, then remove me. But I'm not sending my daughter somewhere else, so this becomes easier to ignore." Something moved across Walt's face. Not much. Just a flicker of something that wasn't quite duty. Then the elevator opened. The woman who stepped out was 53 and moved like someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space approximately 20 years ago. Silver hair cut short. A charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for her specifically, which it had. She was talking to a man in a green tie, something about the shareholder briefing materials, and her voice was efficient, clipped, the kind of voice that expected to be heard. Petra Wyndham, Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Automotive Group. Garrett had studied her in the news coverage from the past 6 years. The turnaround she'd engineered after the 2018 recall crisis. The manufacturing expansion into Quebec. The Ridgeline launch announcement that had been positioned as the centerpiece of Caldwell's next decade. Wyndham. His voice crossed the lobby like a stone hitting still water. Everything paused. Petra turned. The man in the green tie turned. Tristan flinched. Petra's eyes found Garrett. They did the assessment quickly, the way executive eyes do, sorting for threat level and relevance simultaneously. "Who are you?" "Garrett Finch. I need 4 minutes. Mr. Finch, this isn't the time." The Ridgeline torque management defect, the January field incidents, the suppressed engineering report from Gerald Huck's team last March. Petra went very still. Green tie moved slightly. A protective shift, the kind that people in close proximity to power learn to make automatically. "Garrett," Green tie said, "I'm afraid whatever you think you have." "Walt," Petra said, not looking away from Garrett, "call the police." "Ms. Wyndham, this man is trespassing and attempting to interfere with a legally scheduled board proceeding." Her voice was precise and cold. "I want him removed and I want charges filed." Sophie made a small sound. Garrett looked down. Her face had gone pale, the way it did when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of people. She remembered the time 2 winters ago when the truck had slid on black ice on the Magnetawan Road and they'd spun into the ditch. She'd been 5 then, and she'd held completely still the whole time. Even when the truck tipped, even when Garrett had grabbed her arm, she hadn't cried until they were out and standing in the snow and he'd told her they were okay. Then she'd cried for 10 minutes straight. She was holding herself the same way now. "Okay," Garrett said quietly. "Okay." He let Walt steer him toward the doors. Sophie walked beside him, her hand gripping his hard enough that her knuckles went white. Through the glass, Garrett could see the city outside. December in Toronto, gray sky and slush on the Queen Street sidewalks, the particular kind of cold that gets into the joints of people who work outdoors. He'd driven 3.5 hours from Parry Sound that morning. Left the garage dark at 5 a.m., Sophie asleep in the back seat with her blanket and her rabbit-shaped neck pillow. Stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Barrie for coffee and a hot chocolate that Sophie held with both hands and called the best thing she'd ever tasted, which she said about most hot chocolates. He had not wanted to bring her. He'd spent 3 days trying to find someone to stay with her. His neighbor Ray was in Florida until January. The Mercer kids from down the road were too young to supervise. Mrs. Adler from the church had a hip replacement scheduled and couldn't manage stairs. Karen's sister was in Vancouver, and the ticket would have cost more than the garage cleared in a month. So Sophie had come, because there was no one else, and because this was too important to delay, and because Garrett had thought, naively, that walking in with a 7-year-old would signal that he wasn't a threat. Instead, it had signaled nothing, except that he was a man without resources, which Petra Wyndham had apparently already decided. The lobby doors opened. 2 Toronto police officers walked in. Older one, heavier, with the look of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know which direction things were about to go. Younger one, early 30s, with ginger hair and a careful expression. "What's the situation?" The older one addressed Walt. "This man is trespassing," Petra said. "I want him removed and charged." She had followed them to the lobby, Garrett realized. She'd walked over to watch this happen. The older officer looked at Garrett. "Sir, do you have an appointment here?" "No, but I have documented evidence of a safety defect that Caldwell's board is about to vote on deploying into the public market. Hands behind your back, please." "The folder," Garrett said. "If someone in that building reads what's in this folder." "Sir, hands now." His knees hit the marble, cold through the denim. Sophie made a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. A quiet "oh" that wasn't quite a word, and she stepped toward him, one hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. The ginger-haired officer crouched down near Sophie. His voice came out softer than his face suggested. "Hey there, what's your name, Sophie? Sophie, is there someone we can call? Your mom, maybe?" Sophie looked at him steadily. "My mom died." Her voice was factual, not unkind, the way children can sometimes be factual about enormous things. The 2 officers exchanged a look. Something unspoken moved between them. The older one's jaw tightened. "Any other family?" Sophie shook her head. "Neighbors? Family friends?" "Mrs. Adler," Sophie said after a moment. But she just had her hip done. We'll figure something out, the older officer said. His professional neutrality had developed an edge to it that hadn't been there before. They walked Garrett to the cruiser. Sophie walked beside him until the ginger officer gently held her back. Garrett looked at her over his shoulder. Be good for the officers, Bug. I don't want to stay. I know. I'll be back soon. I promise. That word sat in his chest like a stone, because he didn't know if it was true, and he'd made a rule after Karen that he wouldn't promise Sophie things he didn't know. But he said it anyway, because she was 7 and standing in a lobby in Toronto, and she needed something to hold on to. The cruiser door closed. Through the window he could see Wyndham standing by the reception desk. She was looking at the folder. She picked it up, turned it over. The rubber band had loosened during the walk, and the edge of a page was visible. White paper printed with engineering diagrams. She handed it to the man in the green tie, looked away, walked toward the elevators without looking back. Garrett pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the cruiser window. He'd had 2 weeks. 2 weeks since he'd pulled the Ridgeline for service, a fleet vehicle from a construction company in Huntsville that had reported intermittent lurching in 4-wheel drive mode. He'd put it on the lift and spent 3 hours with it before he'd found the pattern. The transfer case actuator ran a torque management sequence that worked fine in temperatures above -10, but began failing its calibration check below -15. In those conditions, under hard acceleration from a stop, the differential could lock asymmetrically. A fraction of a second. Enough. He'd written it up, sent it to Caldwell's customer service. No response. Called their technical line. Transferred 4 times and disconnected. Then he'd started searching, the way he'd learned to search when he was a senior engineer at Meridian Technical, back before Karen got sick, and he'd left to come home to Parry Sound and be closer to her family and eventually to bury her. What he'd found had taken 11 days and most of his sleep. Forum posts from fleet operators in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. A warranty claim database he'd accessed through a former colleague. 3 incidents, all in December and January, all below -15, all the same pattern. One had resulted in a rollover. The driver had walked away. The passenger hadn't. Then he'd found the internal report. Gerald Huck, senior technical engineer at Caldwell, had written it in March. Detailed, thorough, the kind of document that someone with 30 years of drivetrain experience writes when they're genuinely worried. It had been filed, and then, somewhere between Gerald's desk and the executive review process, it had stopped existing. Garrett didn't know who had buried it. He knew that the board was voting today. He'd tried calling. He'd tried emailing. He'd tried reaching Caldwell's legal team, their communications office, their provincial safety liaison. Nothing. Voicemail, automated responses. A polite note from a paralegal saying his concerns had been logged and would be reviewed in order. So he'd put Sophie in the truck at 5 in the morning and driven to Toronto. The holding cell at 52 Division smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. There were 2 other men in it, one reading a paperback with a creased spine, one sleeping across the bench with his arm over his eyes. Garrett sat against the wall and thought about what he'd done wrong. He'd come in too fast, too emotional. Even though he'd felt calm, the emotion had been there in his voice. When he said the word suppressed, he'd heard it himself. He should have had a lawyer. He should have had someone with credentials standing beside him. Someone in a suit that fit. Someone whose presence meant the building had to take him seriously. But lawyers cost money, and the garage had cleared $11,000 last month, which was a good month, and he had Sophie's dental appointment next week, and the truck needed winter tires, and there was no extra. Sophie was with a family services worker now. They'd called one when it became clear there was no one else available immediately. He'd watched through the bars as a woman named Dana had crouched down and introduced herself to Sophie and offered a granola bar, and Sophie had taken it with both hands and thanked her properly. The way Karen had always taught her, and looked back at Garrett with those eyes that said, "I'm going to be fine, but please come back soon." He'd smiled and waved, like this was nothing. Like they hadn't just been removed from a building in front of a dozen witnesses. Like he wasn't sitting here while the board upstairs voted on whether to put 38,000 defective vehicles into winter conditions across 6 provinces. The cell door opened. "Monroe." "Garrett," said the guard. "No, that's not right, Finch. You've got a visitor." He stood. The meeting room was gray and functional, and had the specific bleakness of rooms designed for conversations no one wants to have. The table had names scratched into it. The window looked at a parking structure. Sitting at the table was a man Garrett didn't recognize. Late 60s, lean, with white eyebrows that gave him the look of someone permanently mildly surprised. He wore a vest over a flannel shirt, which in this setting was strange enough to be notable. He had a briefcase open in front of him and a legal pad covered in handwriting. "Mr. Finch," he said, "my name is Bernard Oak. I'm a consulting engineer and part-time legal advocate with Transport Safety Canada's third-party review program." Garrett sat down slowly. "I didn't contact Transport Safety Canada." "No," Gerald Huck did. Bernard set his hands flat on the table. 6 weeks ago, when it became clear that his report wasn't going to reach the board through internal channels. He filed a formal whistleblower notification with our office and requested a third-party technical review. Garrett stared at him. "He knew about you?" Garrett asked. "He knew about the field incidents. He'd found the same forum posts you found, and he'd been following the warranty claims independently." Bernard opened the briefcase. "When he filed with us, he included a notation that a private technician in Parry Sound had been working the same thread. He flagged it as corroborating evidence." "So what now?" "Now I file a federal safety intervention notice on behalf of Transport Safety Canada." Bernard slid a document across the table. "This halts any deployment or production approval for the Ridgeline drivetrain configuration, pending a full independent technical review. Caldwell's board can vote all they want today. The vote won't move into implementation without federal sign-off." Garrett looked at the document. He read it twice. Then he looked up. "Why didn't this happen 3 weeks ago?" "Because federal reviews take time, and Gerald was trying to do it through proper channels first," Bernard said. "He's a careful man. He wanted to be sure before he went federal. The field data that came in from Saskatchewan last week moved the timeline. There was a rollover in Yorkton in November. Yes, the passenger was hospitalized for 9 days. Garrett's jaw tightened, and Caldwell knew. There will be a full investigation into what Caldwell knew and when they knew it. That's a separate process. But the immediate issue, the vote today, that's handled." He sat back. The table between them felt very large. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you here?" "In person, at a police station, on a Friday morning." Bernard looked at him steadily. "Because Gerald asked me to come find you. He's been following the situation. He knew you drove down this morning. He knew they were going to arrest you. He watched what happened. He has a contact inside who told him." Bernard's expression was measured. "He's been trying to protect you from the outside since he couldn't protect his own report from the inside." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He thought about Gerald Huck, whom he'd never met. A man in his 60s who'd written a careful technical document and watched it disappear, and then spent 6 weeks trying to make it matter through every proper channel available to him. A man who had eventually decided the proper channels weren't going to be fast enough and had picked up the phone. He thought about the passenger in Yorkton. "What happens to Gerald?" he asked. "Caldwell will try to manage him, possibly terminate him, possibly be legal pressure." Bernard nodded once. He filed documentation with 3 oversight bodies and has copies stored with his lawyer and his wife's sister in Ottawa. He's been doing this long enough to know how to protect himself. Garrett almost smiled. "Smart man. Very." Bernard closed the briefcase. "Now, let's get you out of here. The charges are being reviewed as we speak. Intervening in a commercial process doesn't hold when the intervention is federally supported, and a good Crown attorney knows that." "What about Sophie? Your daughter is with Family Services." "She's fine, according to Dana Osei, who I spoke with 20 minutes ago. Sophie ate a granola bar and is apparently very interested in whether Dana has been to Newfoundland." Garrett laughed. "It came out rough, exhausted. She wants to see the puffins." Bernard stood. "Let's go get her." They walked out of the station into a December afternoon that had turned colder. Bernard had a car, a sensible gray Subaru with Transport Safety Canada plates, and he drove with the careful focus of someone who'd learned to drive on icy roads and never forgot it. Sophie was in a waiting room on the 2nd floor of the Family Services building. She was sitting next to Dana, looking at something on Dana's phone. And she looked up when Garrett came through the door with the instant full-body relief that children show before they learn to moderate it. "Dad." He caught her, lifted her up, held on. "Did they let you go?" "Yeah, bug." "Because you were right?" "Yeah, something like that." She pressed her face into his neck for a moment, the way she did when she was very relieved and didn't want him to see it. Then she pulled back. "There's a man here," she said. "That's Bernard." He helped. Sophie considered Bernard with the assessing gaze she'd developed for all new people since Karen died. A careful inventory that took in his white eyebrows and his vest, and the kindness in the lines around his eyes. "Thank you for helping my dad," she said. Bernard inclined his head. He helped himself first. "I just made sure the paperwork caught up with him." In the Subaru heading back to where Garrett had parked the truck, Bernard said, "What happens now is going to be complicated. I know. Caldwell's legal team will investigate the source of the document leak. Gerald is protected, but you may not be entirely. They could pursue civil action, claim interference with business proceedings." Garrett looked out the window at the city. The afternoon light was flat and gray, and the slush on the sidewalks had started to freeze. He thought about the garage, about the rack of winter tires he hadn't finished mounting, about the ledger on his desk that he balanced every Friday night after Sophie was in bed. "On what grounds?" he said. "They'll find some. Companies with $1 billion in fleet contracts don't like being embarrassed. Can they win? Probably not. But they don't have to win. They just have to make the process expensive enough that most people give up." Bernard glanced at him. "Most people aren't you. You don't know me. I know you drove 3.5 hours at 5 in the morning with your 7-year-old daughter and walked into a building full of lawyers to hand someone a folder that could have been shredded before you left the parking lot." He kept his eyes on the road. "I know what kind of person does that." Garrett said nothing. They stopped at a light. Somewhere behind them, Sophie was making quiet conversation with herself, narrating something about puffins. "Gerald wants to meet you," Bernard said. "Why?" "Because he spent 8 months watching a report he was proud of get buried by people who should have known better, and then he watched you do the same thing he tried to do, only without the credentials or the federal backing or the salary." He shook his head. "He wants to buy you a coffee, Mr. Finch." "Let him." Garrett looked at the folder on the seat between them. The rubber band had given out completely, and the pages had fanned slightly, the engineering diagrams visible, the careful documentation of something that could kill someone on a January highway in Saskatchewan. "Tell him I'd like that," Garrett said. The news came 3 weeks after the arrest. Garrett was under the ridgeline, which had come back to the garage after a call from the Huntsville fleet manager asking if he could have a look at 3 more of their vehicles, when his phone buzzed on the workbench above him. He pushed out from under, wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt. Transport Safety Canada's text message was brief. It said the Ridgeline drivetrain configuration had been issued a formal safety notice and all units currently in service were being recalled for inspection pending federal review. It said the investigation into internal reporting processes at Caldwell Automotive Group was ongoing. It said a hotline had been established for fleet operators to report incidents or concerns. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down on the workbench. Sophie was doing homework at the small table he'd set up for her in the corner of the office, where she could see him through the glass partition but also have heat. She had a worksheet about fractions spread in front of her, and she was chewing on the eraser end of her pencil, which he'd asked her not to do approximately 400 times. He knocked on the glass. She looked up. He gave her a thumbs up. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but she gave one back anyway, serious and deliberate. Bernard called that evening with more detail. The federal investigation had expanded. 2 former Caldwell executives were cooperating with Transport Safety Canada. The March report from Gerald's team had been recovered from a deleted file archive, still with its original metadata intact, which told a clear story about when it had been accessed and by whom. Gerald, Bernard added, had retained his position. Caldwell's board had opted not to terminate him, likely because their lawyers had informed them that firing a federally protected whistleblower 6 weeks before a safety investigation was not a posture they wanted to defend. "Good," Garrett said. "He also wanted me to pass something along." Bernard's voice was careful. "Caldwell has set aside a fund for affected parties and community organizations impacted by the recall costs. Gerald suggested that the Parry Sound and District Mechanics Association might be appropriate recipients to help cover the cost of warranty repairs for local fleet operators who'll be absorbing the inspection costs." Garrett leaned against the wall. The garage smelled like oil and cold air, and the particular mineral smell of the concrete floor in winter. He'd bought this building 8 years ago with Karen's blessing and his own savings, and 30% of what his father-in-law had lent him, interest-free, with a handshake. "Is Gerald all right?" Garrett asked. "He's well. He says he's sleeping better than he has in 8 months." Garrett nodded even though Bernard couldn't see it. "Tell him I'm glad. He'll be at the safety committee presentation in February. He'd like you there. I'm not an expert. You're a corroborating source and a federal witness." Bernard's voice had the dry precision of a man who'd been doing this a long time. "That's more than enough to have you in the room." Petra Wyndham called him on a Tuesday in January. He almost didn't answer, because the number came up as a Toronto area code he didn't recognize, and he'd been getting calls from journalists for 2 weeks and had stopped picking up unknown numbers. But something about the time, 2:15 in the afternoon, a strange hour for a journalist, made him answer. "Mr. Finch." Her voice was the same, efficient and controlled, but something underneath it had changed. A particular quality of certainty was gone. "Ms. Wyndham, I'm calling to offer a formal apology on behalf of Caldwell Automotive Group for the manner in which you were treated during your visit to our offices in December." The pause was very brief. "I'm also calling to offer a personal apology for my own conduct." Garrett was standing at the workbench. He set down the torque wrench in his hand. "Okay," he said. "I was wrong to dismiss you. I was wrong to have you arrested. I had information that should have given me pause, and I chose to ignore it because I was 3 weeks from closing a production cycle I'd been building toward for 2 years." Petra's voice was even careful. "That is not an excuse. That is an explanation." "What do you want from me, Ms. Wyndham?" "Nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I understand what you did and why it mattered." The passenger in Yorkton. If the Ridgeline had gone to full fleet deployment in January, Garrett said nothing. He let her finish. "I authorized the shredding of your documents," she said finally. "I told Marcus to destroy them before I went into the boardroom. And then I spent 40 minutes in that boardroom unable to concentrate, because the number you said, 38,000, wouldn't leave my head." He looked through the glass partition at Sophie. She had finished her homework and was drawing something elaborate and focused, her tongue pressed between her teeth. "What happened to the person who buried Gerald's report?" he asked. "That's part of the ongoing federal investigation." Petra's voice was precise. "I can't discuss specifics. But you know who it was." "I have a very clear picture, yes." He nodded. "Was it you?" The pause was 3 seconds long. "No," she said. "I didn't know the report existed until after the federal intervention. That is the part I find most difficult to accept about myself. That someone in my organization was able to suppress a critical safety document for 8 months without my knowledge, which means I built a culture that made that possible." Garrett thought about that, about what it meant to be the person at the top, and also the person who didn't know. "That's a hard thing to sit with," he said. "It is. For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you were pointed in one direction and someone made sure you stayed that way." She was quiet. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. "You're more generous than I'd be," she said. "I've had practice at not staying angry." He didn't explain what he meant by that. She didn't ask. After she hung up, he stood in the garage for a while, looking at nothing in particular. The lift was up with a Tacoma on it, mid-service, client coming back at 4. His breath made small clouds in the cold air before the space heater caught up. Outside, the Parry Sound winter was doing what it always did in January, pressing down with a particular insistence, the trees bare and the lake frozen and the light having that quality of absolute honesty that comes when everything is stripped back. He thought about Karen. He did this sometimes, not with grief exactly, more with a kind of checking in, the way you might touch a doorframe when walking past it. She'd been the one who had pushed him to go back to engineering when he'd taken the garage job originally, telling him he was hiding himself in the work, that he was using the busyness as shelter. She'd been right. She'd been right about most things. She'd also been the one who said, when she was very sick and knew it, that the worst thing he could do for Sophie was become someone who had given up, who didn't still believe the right thing was worth doing. He'd thought about that in the lobby of Caldwell Automotive Group. He'd thought about it on the floor of the holding cell. He thought about it now. Sophie knocked on the glass. She held up her drawing. It was a puffin, improbable and cheerful, with a bright orange beak and small determined wings. He laughed and gave her a thumbs up. She grinned and went back to it. The safety committee presentation happened on a Thursday in February. In an Ottawa boardroom that looked like every other federal boardroom, functional and gray, and lit with the particular fluorescence that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Garrett drove up the night before, Sophie with him because school was closed for a PA day, staying at a hotel that had a pool she'd been talking about for 2 weeks. Gerald Huck was already in the building when they arrived. He was shorter than Garrett had pictured, compact and precise in his movements, with the particular hands of someone who had spent decades working on engines before moving to a desk. He stood when Garrett came in and extended his hand. "You're Finch," he said, "and you're Gerald." Sophie shook his hand too, solemnly, because she considered this appropriate in professional settings. They sat next to each other for the presentation. Bernard led it. Transport Safety Canada representatives asked questions that were technical and careful and occasionally sharp. Garrett answered what he could. Gerald answered the rest with the quiet authority of someone whose work had been proven right. At one point, a commissioner asked Gerald directly why he had not escalated through Caldwell's internal process earlier. "I did," Gerald said, 3 times over 6 months. Each time I was told the report was under review and that I should trust the process. And you stopped trusting it. I stopped trusting it when I realized the process had been redesigned to produce a specific outcome," Gerald said. His voice was even. "That's when I contacted Transport Safety Canada." The commissioner made a note. After the presentation, in the hallway, Gerald bought Garrett a coffee from a machine that did a credible job. They stood near a window that looked out at the Rideau Canal, frozen solid with the last of the Winterlude skaters making their way across in the gray afternoon light. "I've been doing this for 31 years, Gerald said. "Inspecting things? Engineering. Safety review. Watching the gap between what companies say they do and what they actually do." He held his coffee with both hands. This one was different. This wasn't corner cutting or optimization pressure. Someone made a deliberate decision to prevent that report from moving forward. "Do you know who?" "I have a strong suspicion." Gerald's jaw tightened. "The investigation will confirm it." "Does it matter now that the recall's in place?" Gerald looked at him steadily. "It matters because the next engineer who writes a report like mine needs to know that burying it has consequences. If the person who did this walks away, the next person who finds something they want to hide will remember that." Garrett thought about Yorkton. About 38,000 vehicles in January weather. "Yeah," he said. "It matters." They drove back to Parry Sound that night, Sophie asleep in the back seat with the rabbit neck pillow, the highway empty and dark, the kind of northern Ontario night that feels larger than most nights, the stars very bright and the trees very black and the road stretching ahead in the headlights. 3 months later, on a Saturday in May, a letter arrived from Caldwell Automotive Group. It was addressed formally and opened with language that sounded like it had been written by several lawyers. It offered compensation to Garrett for the wrongful arrest and the disruption to his business in December. The number was significant. He read it twice. Then he put it on the kitchen table and made Sophie's breakfast and walked her to the park down the road, where she spent Saturday mornings with a group of neighborhood kids who had a complicated ongoing game involving territories and flags and rules that changed every week. He sat on the bench and watched her run. A man sitting nearby was watching his own kids on the structure, 2 boys who were engaged in some disagreement about climbing order. He nodded at Garrett in the way that people in Parry Sound nod at each other, the acknowledgement between people who share a geography. "You the garage guy?" he said. "Sorry?" "On Church Street." "Finch's? Yeah. My brother-in-law took his truck to you in the fall. Said you were the one who found the thing with the ridge line." Garrett looked at his hands. "Yeah, that was me." The man nodded slowly. He's a fleet manager, had 11 of those vehicles. He'd have been putting them on the highway all winter. Garrett watched Sophie climb to the top of the structure and wave at him from the peak with both hands. He waved back. "Tell your brother-in-law the recall repairs should be covered under the federal compensation program," he said. "Tell him to call Transport Safety Canada if Caldwell gives him any trouble." The man nodded again. "Appreciate it." They sat in silence for a while, watching their kids, the May air finally carrying some warmth, the leaves on the maples new enough to be bright. That evening, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the Caldwell letter in front of him again. Sophie was in bed. The house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when it's just you and a child. The particular weighted quiet of single parenthood. He thought about Karen, about what she would say. She would say, "Take the money, Garrett." She would say, "You work too hard and you worry too much, and Sophie deserves a dad who's not exhausted, and the dental bill isn't going to pay itself." He thought about the Mechanics Association in Parry Sound, about the fleet operators who'd absorbed inspection costs and scheduling disruptions during the recall, about the community rink that needed new boards, which Sophie had mentioned 17 times since January. He called Bernard the next morning. "The letter from Caldwell," he said. "I want to accept half of it personally." Bernard was quiet for a moment. "And the other half?" Garrett told him what he was thinking. Bernard listened without interrupting. "That's a very Gerald thing to do," Bernard said. "Is that good?" Bernard considered. "Gerald is one of the most genuinely decent people I've met in 30 years of doing this work," he said. "So yes, I think that's good." He called a lawyer in Parry Sound that afternoon, a woman named Linda who had handled Karen's estate and who charged fair rates and returned calls the same day. She walked him through the acceptance documents over the phone. He signed them that night at the kitchen table, Sophie's drawings still on the refrigerator, the sound of the neighbor's dog barking twice at nothing particular, and then going quiet. Summer came the way it always did in Parry Sound, fast and bright and certain of itself. The garage was busy. Sophie had started a day camp at the waterfront and came home every evening smelling like sunscreen and lake water, full of reports about kayaking and a boy named Felix, who had capsized twice in one afternoon, which she found both impressive and concerning. Gerald came to visit in July. He'd mentioned it in an email, and Garrett had said he was welcome, and not been entirely sure he'd actually show up. But he did, arriving in a rented Civic on a Saturday morning, wearing civilian clothes that made him look less like an engineer and more like someone's uncle. They drove out to the waterfront, the three of them, Sophie between them eating an ice cream that was losing the battle with the heat, and looked at the lake. "I retired last month," Gerald said. Garrett looked at him. "For real?" "Effective the 31st. Gerald squinted at the water. 31 years. "I wanted to go on my own terms. Do you miss it?" "I miss the work. I don't miss the environment that surrounded it." He was quiet for a moment. The investigation concluded. "There will be charges filed against 2 people in Caldwell's executive structure." "Who?" "Their VP of Product Development and the head of Internal Compliance." Gerald's voice was even. "The compliance head was the one who intercepted my report. The VP was the one who told him to." "What about Wyndham?" "She was not found to have prior knowledge." Bernard paused. That conclusion was supported by the evidence. "Do you believe it?" "I believe she built a structure that made it too easy for certain kinds of decisions to happen without her." He looked at his shoes. "Whether that makes her responsible is a question I don't have a clean answer to." Sophie finished her ice cream and asked if she could go look at the boats. Garrett said yes, and watched her walk toward the dock with the particular purposeful trot she did when she was interested in something. "She looks like someone who knows what she wants," Gerald said. "She does," Garrett agreed. "She gets it from her mother," Gerald nodded. "You must miss her every day." Garrett looked at the lake. "It gets different. Not less, just different, I imagine." Gerald stayed for dinner. Garrett made the pasta thing he was reliably good at, Sophie's request, and they ate at the kitchen table with the window open, the evening coming in warm and smelling like the neighbor's garden. After Gerald left, Sophie helped clear the table, which she always did without being asked since Karen, one of those things she'd taken on quietly and never stopped. "I like Gerald," she said. "Yeah? He's serious, but he's nice at the same time." She stacked the plates carefully. "Some people are one or the other." Garrett dried his hands on the dish towel and looked at his daughter, who at 7 had somehow already worked this out. "You're right," he said. "He's both." She nodded, satisfied, and went to finish the book she was reading. He stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the window at the backyard, at the garden he kept meaning to do something with, and never quite got around to, at the bird feeder Karen had put up the first spring they'd been in this house that he'd refilled every February since, without making a conscious decision to. He thought about what it meant to have done the right thing and not been sure it would matter. About the 3.5 hours in the dark at 5 in the morning, Sophie breathing slowly in the back seat, the highway empty and the sky still black, driving toward something that might have come to nothing. It hadn't come to nothing. That wasn't always how it went. He knew that. He'd been lucky in some ways. Lucky that Gerald had already started the process. Lucky that Bernard had come to the station. Lucky that Sophie had charmed the ginger-haired officer into something approaching softness. But luck wasn't the whole of it. You still had to make the drive. You still had to walk through the door. You still had to stand on the cold marble floor of that lobby and say the thing you'd come to say, even when everyone in the room was already looking at you, like you were something that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. Karen had always said that courage wasn't the absence of knowing it might not work out. It was doing the thing anyway and meaning it. He turned off the kitchen light, checked the doors, went to say goodnight to Sophie. She was already almost asleep, the book face down on the pillow beside her. Night, bug. Night, Dad. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside, the Parry Sound summer was doing what it did, full and green and generous, the kind of evening where the sky stayed light until almost 10, and the whole world felt like it had more room in it than usual. He went to bed and slept without the dreams that had kept him up in December, the ones about highway ice and vehicles and ditches and folders being fed into shredders. Just darkness. Just rest. In the morning, Sophie would want pancakes. He would make them, probably slightly uneven, and she would eat them with too much maple syrup and tell him about whatever she was planning for the day. He would walk her to camp, take the long way past the lake because they both liked it, and then open the garage and work. That was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't always known it.